Hey, 11th grade students, we're going to investigate the time period of the Second Industrial Revolution. This time period begins at the end of the Civil War, and it really goes all the way through the early 20th century. We could say that we are still in a modern industrial age, but the dawn of that industrial age, like its beginning, was the end of the American Civil War. Let's talk now about the learning objectives that we're going to cover, and I want you to pay close attention to the names and vocabulary within the learning objectives, because as you think about what you'll be assessed on, we're going to be assessing the learning objectives, and therefore the names and phrases in these learning objectives as we proceed forward will be very important to you. So let's read through the learning objectives very quickly. Interpret the impact of change from workshop to factory on workers' lives, including the new industrial age from 1870 until 1900, the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Workers, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Pullman Strike, Haymarket Square Riot, the impact of John David Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Samuel Gompers, Eugene Debs, A. Philip Randolph, and Thomas Edison. Okay, so those names important, and today we will talk about Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie specifically, and even Thomas Edison. So let's dive right in. Okay, so as mentioned previously, the modern industrial revolution began at the close of the American Civil War. There were many reasons why this industrial age dawned in the United States. One, because of the abundance of natural resources. If you look at this map of natural resources, you see that there is a great deal of iron deposits, a great deal of ore deposits, oil, so natural resources in abundance, and even, of course, gold and silver. So lots of natural resources will allow for this industrial age to grow. Also, labor, particularly the large numbers of immigrants that are coming into the United States, but in this age will feel the labor need in factories in the East. Okay, so large populations that's constantly growing with immigrants will meet the need of industrial labor. So resources, labor allows for an industrial age to grow here in the United States. And then there's also government support of business. The U.S. government will employ a policy, and I want you to write this down because you're going to hear it, and it's an idea of laissez-faire. Okay, so the government kind of keeps its hands off the economy. They don't regulate the economy with laws, an overwhelming amount of laws, so that stay out of the economy position that the government takes will help for the economy to grow. Also, they say that they have this laissez-faire business approach, but they encourage economic growth in several ways. Let's talk about that. They issue land grants to businesses. A grant is where the government just gives you something and you don't give them in return anything. Railroad companies are particularly they will receive those land grants. They're particular recipients of those land grants. Okay, and then the Homestead Act allows for individual American citizens to claim lands out west. So these acts, the Homestead Act, and then the land grants that the U.S. government gives to many rail companies, that's going to encourage not only westward expansion, but also industrial growth. So the primary causes of an industrial revolution post-Civil War will be growing American populations that meet the need for labor, large-scale resources, and untapped resources. You think at this time most of the West has not been settled by people of European descent or people with U.S. citizenship. The West hasn't been settled by those people. It's been settled largely by natives prior to this point. And then you see the support of U.S. government for business in their giving land grants and in their laissez-faire approach, like staying out of regulating business. Those things encourage industrial growth in the U.S. Okay, and then in talking about natural resources, the use of oil is going to spur economic activity, particularly industrial economic activity in the United States. So prior to the 1860s in this industrial age, Native people out in the West had used oil in basic usages. For lighting, they used oil, but it wasn't used in large part for any sort of industrial use. Okay, that changed when Edwin L. Drake used the first steam engine to drill for oil. So oil now, it became easily accessible using a steam engine to drill for oil. So it wasn't something, it was now more cost beneficial to drill for oil using a steam engine. And then the petroleum refining process allowed for a cleaner oil for burning and lighting. Okay, so this oil is kerosene. It's very important for you guys to note that the first oil that was drilled for and manufactured on a large scale was used for lighting, so kerosene and kerosene lamps. The byproduct of refining for kerosene, what was thrown away was petroleum gasoline, and eventually when the automobile was introduced, then gasoline became the primary use for oil, but originally it was kerosene. So a couple of things I want to point out here. This age of industry saw the rise of these men who built powerful industries. Okay, the oil industry, without dispute, the man at the top of the oil industry was John David Rockefeller. Rockefeller was he built Standard Oil Company. He became a millionaire. He controlled a lot of that industry. He would lower his prices to put out competitors and then buy their oil refining. So what we see in the industrial age is the rise of monopolies, like one person or one business that controls an entire enterprise. And Rockefeller was that titan of industry. You could call him a titan of industry. Some might call him a robber baron of the oil industry. Okay, so oil there we've discussed. And then another industry where we see a titan of industry rise by controlling the automobile industry in the 20th century. So in the 20th century, Henry Ford will come to dominate that automobile industry. And we'll talk more about Ford a little later. Okay, so now moving into a new industry that changes the landscape of this industrial age, the steel industry. Okay, so steel is lighter weight than iron, and it is cleaner. The first primary construction material that was used during the 19th century, during the 1800s, was iron. Iron is heavy, it's easily corroded, it rusts very easily. So cities that are building with these with steel in the frame, okay, they're limited to the height, and the durability of their building isn't doesn't have that longevity. So, but steel is in the early 1800s, it was difficult to make steel. It was very costly to make it. The Bessemer process changed that. Okay, there was a British and American partner, British and American partners, who came up with, you could say, invented this Bessemer process. And what they did was they, as they were heating iron, they did it in an open cauldron, and air moved in and it removed the impurities in the iron and created steel. This open cauldron Bessemer process made steel cheaper to manufacture, and it could be mass manufactured. So now you have this better product that can be mass manufactured, and it's going to change the landscape of the entire world. So steel is used in one of the great building projects in New York City in the 1880s. The cables here on the Brooklyn Bridge are made of steel. Also, steel is used in just building material. It makes up the frame for these buildings, these skyscrapers that we start to see in cities like New York and Chicago. And so cities are building up and not out. So they're conserving space, and it seems like an unlimited a prospect for growth when you can move upward. Also, the railroad industry is booming at this time, and so it's going to demand steel. So you're going to see a constant increase in the demand for steel because the rails are now going to be made of steel. Barbed wire is a modern invention that's also going to use steel as a raw material. So steel changes the landscape of the modern world. Okay, so this is also an age of invention. And Thomas Edison creates the first research laboratory in New Jersey. And from that research laboratory, we're going to have the patent for the incandescent light bulb. And he's also going to come up with a system for harnessing that electricity and moving that electricity from points, like a point A to a point B. That system that Edison creates will allow for electricity to power urban transportation. So people will not only be able to travel within the city using public transportation cheaper, but they can now also travel farther outside of the city. So you're going to see some suburbs pop up, and the transportation is made possible by electricity. So you don't have like horse-drawn streetcars. Now you have electric-powered streetcars. You also see the availability of these factories to run around the clock. Okay, they're running around the clock. And then you see less fires in these cities because now they're going to be lighted by electricity as opposed to lighted by kerosene lamps. You're going to see electricity in homes by the early 1900s, early 20th century, and then electricity is going to allow for time-saving machines to be invented. So all of those things, these home appliances, are going to be made possible by electricity. And then you have the mass production of all of these goods. So factories are going to go electric. New appliances will allow for more industrial opportunity. Okay, so other inventions that change people's lives. The new invention, the telephone, is going to change communication. So prior to this, the telegraph was the primary mode of transportation. Alexander Graham Bell invents the telephone. Sholes invents the typewriter. And it's going to not only make communication more efficient, it will also change businesses, because now you're going to have a completely new kind of work, like secretarial and office work. Now, women are going to start to make up a larger percentage of the workforce. By the early 1900s, about 40% of people working in clerical work, like this office work with recording, record keeping, that sort of thing, about 40% of people working in clerical jobs will be women. Okay, so a few things I want us to talk about as we end section 1. I want you to know titans of industry. So Titans of industry are these champions of certain industrial fields. In the railroad industry, there was Cornelius Vanderbilt. And in the oil industry, of course, there was John David Rockefeller. In the steel industry, there's Andrew Carnegie. In Chicago, there's Philip Armour. Philip Armour is a meat packing titan.